magic.
So.
Hey y'all, so I just finished watching the TV show The Resort, which I want to highly endorse to you. It may not seem like your cup of tea right off the bat, particularly if you're not into, magical realism, but it's a great show. So let me tell you a little bit about why. So The Resort is a mystery, an adventure story, almost a Hardy Boys, or better yet, one of those Hardy Boys Nancy Drew crossovers, but set in Mexico and with a heavy dose of magical realism. Better yet, maybe a heavy dose of the Fae, and I will unpack a little bit of that shortly. But the plot is that this married couple in their late 30s, I imagine, go to a resort in the Yucatan Peninsula to sort of press the refresh button on their marriage. And the wife discovers this mystery. 2 kids who disappeared during a hurricane at a resort that was destroyed 15 years ago.
Mezcal on the house.
She finds these threads and starts to pull on them to the frustration of her husband, but they follow these threads, and one thing leads to another, one character leads to another character. And I said Nancy Drew Hardy Boys crossover, which were great, by the way. There's a bit of a Scooby-Doo element to it, too, in the sense that there is something mystical, something creepy going on. But what makes it better than a Scooby-Doo is the fact that, well, it's magical realism. It's not really surrealism. It's Latin America. It's fairy in Mexico. So I'd like you to enjoy the plot, hopefully, and enjoy the story. So I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I want to talk about some elements that I hope you'll find appealing. First off, I'll deal with a couple of baser comments. The first is that they're both things that were really refreshing from this particular show. The first is that the husband and wife, the husband is black, the wife is white, and that doesn't become a thing. And I don't mean that, in the story it's ignored. I think at one point the husband might express frustration at the behavior of his crazy white wife. But it's not really a thing. They are a married couple. And the fact that one is black and one is white isn't allowed to come and interfere with that story of them being married and of them working on their relationship, which I found extremely refreshing. And I know that by speaking of it, I'm breaking that magic spell. But we live in an age where that's just we as viewers can't help but have that always kind of at the front of our mind. So that's not there, and it's absolutely wonderful. The other thing is that several characters have personal tragedy that are influencing them through this story, and this married couple, particularly the woman, have the trauma of the death of a child. But it's important to note, again, along the lines of refreshing, the child was never born. And yet the tragedy of it is taken seriously. And the effect that it has on both of them is taken as seriously as any other death. Like I said, refreshing. So a little word about magical realism. You may find it off-putting, and I would get that. In fact, I don't enjoy magic realism as a literary genre. I enjoy elements of it. I like it in other media. And separating magical realism. I mean, all it really means is that it's set in a recognizably real world, but magical or unreal, inexplicable things happen, and due to what is called authorial reticence, it's never explained or explained away. It simply is, and we have to accept it, which fits in with surrealism, but also with how Tolkien talks about fairy stories in his essay on fairy stories. He holds up Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as a perfect example of this. Well, a fairy story, as opposed to a fable or a story that has magic in it, one of the things that is key for a fairy story to be fey is that the magic not be broken, not be explained away. It simply is. And we, as the hearer of the story, simply have to accept that that's how it is. And that's one of the ways you know that the story is set in fairy somehow, right? And what is the real world fairy? Well, apparently it's Mexico. There's a very strong association of magical realism with Latin America. Now, unfortunately, as far as like not the legitimacy of the literature and art created from it, but rather for I suppose the purity of how we might think of the concept. Because really, magical realism starts in Europe as a movement. It did become a coded way to be able to talk about society and politics, and some great works came out of that. But really what is appealing about this show, about the resort, is that it is true, pure, original, unfettered magical realism. I would say unfettered fairy story. And it sort of depends on your perspective. A lot of people say that Neil Gaiman, is a magical realist author. I doubt he would. I know he embraces fairy, right? He is definitely a fae sort of writer. This show reminds me a little bit of Lodge 49, another show I highly recommend to you. It ran for 2 seasons and then unfortunately was canceled. And I loved the entire thing for a lot of the same reasons I loved The Resort. One of the fantastic things about this sort of storytelling is that it is unabashedly symbological and typological. It's part of its magic, and it's baroque. It's layered. It's dense. It has plenitude, right? So there's just so much going on, and layer upon layer, which is why jungles work well for it, right? Just layer after layer of life, decay, and death, and life, decay, and death, and life, decay, and death, and it's all intermingled, and it's hard to tell what started when, and is time even a thing? And I think that makes it a little easier for us to accept the magic that is entering in. Lodge 49 is based on a Thomas Pynchon novella, and he is thought of as as a quintessentially postmodern sort of author. And I never read that novella, although apparently it was quite hip back when Pynchon was hip. And Hollywoodsters quite loved him and that story, probably not least because it's quite short compared to his usual tomes. But I would say that Pynchon is more surrealist than magical realist, right? Surreal is just where there's an air of irreality or otherness. But well done magical realism feels real, just as well done fairy stories feel real. So nothing feels random in the midst of all this plenitude of all this magic. Rather, everything means something, and in a very self-conscious way. I mean, you may find yourself watching and think, well, what does this mean? What does this mean? But it doesn't feel burdensome. You know, often when one is appreciating a work of art of any sort, when you're constantly being asked to ask, what does this mean? That can feel like a burden, like the artist isn't doing their job. But that's not the case here. It almost invites you to be interpreting it, and it's often quite heavy-handed. That I will tell you what the last words of in English in this TV show are. Something like,
"It all kind of seems like a bunch of bullshit."
If you watch this show with a jaded or cynical eye, you will absolutely hate it. Okay? And when I say heavy-handed, I suppose what I mean is generously handed, right? So you want a cook to be someone who is generous. You know, you want your home cooking particularly. You want there to be lots of garlic, lots of seasoning, lots of spices. Over the top, sure. This thing ain't subtle, but that is what makes it fun. Like I said, a Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew thing. So I would recommend this show to you. I've tried, and I think I've succeeded in not going into any detail. Just tell you that I loved it, and I love it because it is fairy. It's entertaining. It moves along quickly. The one thing I haven't talked about, which I'll sort of close with this, the characters are all respected. I think I alluded to that a little bit in talking about the marriage of the two main characters. But every new character that's introduced, as bizarre as they and their circumstances may be, everything feels extremely human, and their life and their experiences are honored and taken seriously. I suppose that's part of the magic, right? You don't explain any of the magic, and some of the magic is not finding these stories and these characters too ridiculous. And the show does a really good job of just inviting you into that. It's a very generous show, and if you view it generously, I think you'll love it. If you've watched the show at all, or if this makes you go watch it, come on back. I'd love to hear in the comments how it was for you. All right, y'all. The peace of Christ be upon you. I should add a caveat. There are a couple of penises and sexual references out there. No sexual deeds or acts on screen, but there's definitely some schlong time with one of the characters. Yep. All right.
What day is it today? Remind me.
It's Sunday, Mr. Pension.
Sunday. And what do we do on a Sunday morning, wherever we happen to be? We go to church, you bloody heathen!